Have you ever woken up in a cold sweat, heart pounding, convinced that something from your dream followed you back into reality? My name is Selim Veldran, and I've spent years investigating the unexplainable, haunted houses, cursed objects, whispers of the supernatural. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened under the blood moon. It started as a dream, or so I told myself, the kind of dream that clings to you, filling every shadow of your mind with doubt and dread. Imagine this, a crimson moon hanging low in the sky, its glow so vivid it painted the world in shades of blood. The air was suffocating, thick with a metallic tang that stung my nose and tasted of fear. The trees around me loomed like skeletal sentinels, their branches clawing at the heavens, as if trying to escape the cursed light. The silence was unnerving, but it didn't last. A faint whisper broke through, carried on a breeze that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The voice wasn't human. It was fragmented, like words spoken underwater. It felt like a summons, pulling me deeper into the darkness. My instincts screamed at me to wake up, to run, but I couldn't move. My feet sank into the ground, the soil cold and wet, like stepping into fresh graves. Each step seemed heavier, as if the forest itself was trying to consume me. That's when I saw it, the silhouette of a figure, barely visible against the blood-drenched horizon. It stood impossibly still, yet its presence radiated malice, a force so palpable it pressed against my chest. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. My eyes were locked on the figure, and as I strained to see its face, the crimson moon seemed to dim, as if the light itself recoiled from the entity. Suddenly, a sound shattered the stillness, a low, guttural growl that vibrated through the air. It didn't come from the figure. It came from behind me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I turned slowly, my body trembling with a primal fear I couldn't suppress. What I saw defies explanation. Shadows, impossibly dense and alive, coiled and writhed like snakes. They moved with purpose, slithering toward me, their shapes constantly shifting into grotesque forms. Faces twisted in agony, clawed hands reaching out, mouths opening wide in silent screams. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The air had turned to ice, stealing the breath from my lungs. I was trapped, frozen, and the only thing that broke the paralysis was the sound of my own heartbeat, hammering in my ears like a death knell. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, yet the words were in no language I could understand. They weren't meant to be understood. They were meant to be felt, a warning or perhaps a curse. Just as the shadows closed in, the figure in the distance moved. Its head tilted unnaturally, and a hand, long, skeletal, and dripping with black ichor, rose to point directly at me. In that moment, I knew I wasn't dreaming. Or if I was, this was a dream meant to kill. But before the darkness consumed me, a single word cut through the cacophony, clear and sharp. Run. It wasn't a whisper, it was my own voice. The force of it jolted me awake, my chest heaving, my body drenched in sweat. My room was dark, the faint glow of the moon outside casting long shadows on the walls. But when I looked at my hand, my stomach dropped. There it was, the symbol from the dream, carved into my palm, still glistening as if freshly etched. Was it just a nightmare, or had I brought something back with me? I didn't have time to process the answer, but one thing was clear. The blood moon had marked me, and whatever was waiting on the other side wasn't finished with me yet. If this story chills you to the bone, subscribe to the channel now. The line between dreams and reality may be thinner than you think, and what happened to me could happen to you. It began like any other restless night, the kind where sleep feels like an uneasy truce between your body and your mind. But as soon as I closed my eyes, the world shifted. Suddenly, I was standing in the middle of an unfamiliar place, a forest drenched in an otherworldly red light. The moon above wasn't the soft white orb we know. It was massive, burning crimson like a bleeding wound in the sky, casting the entire landscape in shades of scarlet and shadow. The air was heavy, oppressive, and carried an unnatural chill that made every breath feel like swallowing shards of ice. The forest itself was wrong. The trees were impossibly tall, their gnarled branches clawing at the sky as though in agony. Their bark seemed to move, writhing like flesh, with patterns that resembled screaming faces etched into the surface. The ground beneath me was soft and wet, but it wasn't mud. It felt spongy, almost alive, and each step produced a faint squelching sound that sent shivers down my spine. A metallic tang hung in the air, sharp and overwhelming, as if the forest itself were bleeding. Then the silence broke. A faint sound reached my ears, barely audible at first but unmistakably there, a low melodic hum, like a distant choir singing a song meant to summon something ancient and malevolent. The sound seemed to come from every direction, growing louder as I ventured deeper into the forest. With every step, my unease grew. The shadows around me weren't just dark, they felt alive, shifting and pulsating in the corners of my vision. I could feel them watching me, their invisible gazes crawling over my skin like cold fingers. As I walked, I began to notice strange details in the landscape, things that didn't belong. A rusted lantern hanging from a twisted tree, its glass cracked and smeared with what looked like dried blood. A tattered doll half buried in the ground, its button eyes staring blankly into the void. The forest felt ancient, but these objects hinted at something more sinister, traces of others who had been here before me. Then I heard it, a distinct, rhythmic crunching sound like footsteps on brittle leaves. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned toward the noise, expecting to see someone or something. But there was nothing, just the forest, its shadows shifting in unnatural patterns. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but the sound continued, growing louder, closer, until it felt like it was right behind me. I spun around, my breath hitching, and that's when I saw it, a figure in the distance, standing perfectly still among the trees. Its shape was humanoid, but wrong, its limbs elongated and slightly bent, as though it had been stretched too far. Its face was obscured, shrouded in the shadows cast by the crimson moon. Despite the distance, I could feel its gaze locked onto me, a sensation that pierced through my chest like icy needles. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. My legs felt like they were sinking into the soft ground, rooting me in place. The figure began to move, its steps slow and deliberate, as if savoring the moment. I tried to look away, but my eyes were drawn to it, as though an invisible force compelled me to watch. The whispers began then, faint at first, like the forest itself was speaking to me. The words were incomprehensible, guttural and fragmented, yet they carried an undeniable weight, pressing down on me like a physical force. My chest tightened as the whispers grew louder, merging with the distant hum that had filled the air since I arrived. The figure stopped suddenly, its head tilting at an unnatural angle, as though it was listening to something I couldn't hear. Then it pointed at me, its arm extended in a jerky, unnatural motion, and I felt a searing pain in my chest, as if invisible claws were ripping into me. I stumbled backward, gasping for air, and that's when I noticed something even more horrifying. The shadows around me weren't just watching anymore. They were moving, closing in like a tide of darkness. A sudden, piercing scream shattered the air, a sound so primal and filled with anguish that it made my blood run cold. I couldn't tell if it came from me or the forest itself, but it was enough to snap me out of my paralysis. I turned and ran, the soft ground sucking at my feet with every step. The shadows chased me, their forms shifting into grotesque shapes, faces twisted in agony, skeletal hands reaching out, and empty, hollow eyes that seemed to swallow the moonlight. Ahead, through the trees, I saw a faint glow, a clearing bathed in crimson light. Desperation drove me forward, even as the whispers grew deafening, a cacophony of voices screaming and laughing in my ears. I broke through the trees and stumbled into the clearing, only to find myself face to face with something that made my blood freeze. A stone altar, covered in fresh blood, with an ancient symbol carved deep into its surface. The symbol pulsed with a dark energy, and as I stared at it, something in my mind broke. It was the same symbol I had seen before, years ago, during an investigation that nearly cost me my life. But how could it be here, in this place that only existed in my dreams? As the realization hit me, the figure emerged from the shadows, standing across the altar, its crimson eyes glowing with malevolent intent. And then, everything went black. When I woke, or at least thought I had, I found myself still trapped in the same oppressive crimson forest. But now something had shifted. The air felt heavier, each breath a struggle, as if the atmosphere itself were conspiring to crush me. The altar was gone, but its presence lingered, etched into my mind like a phantom brand. The trees, twisted and jagged, seemed to lean closer, their bark splitting to reveal something darker underneath, flesh-like textures that pulsed faintly as if alive. I tried to retrace my steps, to escape this suffocating maze, but every turn led me back to where I started. The whispers that had haunted me before were louder now, overlapping voices that spoke in a guttural, ancient language. Their tone wasn't just menacing, it was mocking, as if the forest itself was aware of my fear and relished every moment of my panic. Shadows danced just beyond the edges of my vision, moving with purpose, though no light source existed to cast them. And then the forest began to reveal its secrets. Objects appeared in the undergrowth, personal items abandoned and decayed. A pair of broken glasses, a shoe half buried in the soil, a rusted locket hanging from a low branch. Each artifact felt eerily familiar, though I was certain I'd never seen them before. As I reached out to touch the locket, it swung violently, as if yanked by an invisible hand. A guttural growl emanated from the darkness, low and resonant, shaking the ground beneath my feet. Panic surged through me as I stumbled backward, my heart pounding against my ribcage. I knew I wasn't alone anymore. The forest wasn't just watching me, it was hunting me. The growl turned into a series of sharp, clicking sounds, like bones snapping and realigning. Then in the distance I saw it. A figure crouched low to the ground, its form barely discernible against the shadows. Its movements were jerky and unnatural, as though its joints bent in ways they shouldn't. Every instinct told me to run, but my legs refused to move. The figure lifted its head, revealing a face half hidden by darkness. Its eyes glowed with an unsettling crimson light, but there was something more terrifying than their color. It was the emptiness behind them. Those eyes didn't just see me. They seemed to strip me of everything I was, leaving me exposed and vulnerable. Finally, my body responded. I turned and sprinted, branches tearing at my skin as I forced my way through the dense forest. But the whispers grew louder, no longer fragmented but forming coherent words. "You cannot leave." The phrase repeated over and over, a chant that echoed in my mind, drowning out my own thoughts. As I ran, the forest seemed to stretch and twist around me, distorting space itself. The trees elongated, their branches intertwining above me to form a suffocating canopy. The ground beneath my feet began to shift, each step sinking deeper into the earth, as if it were trying to swallow me whole. Then I saw it, a faint light flickering in the distance. Hope surged in my chest, but it was short-lived. The light wasn't a way out. It was a doorway. A massive, ancient wooden door stood in the middle of the forest, its surface engraved with the same symbol from the altar. The symbol pulsated faintly, as if alive, and the whispers quieted for a brief moment, replaced by an eerie silence. I hesitated, torn between the fear of what lay behind the door and the terror of staying in the forest. Before I could decide, a scream ripped through the air, an agonized, inhuman wail that sent chills down my spine. The shadows around me surged forward, closing in, their grotesque forms writhing and reaching. With no other choice, I pushed the door open and stumbled through, my heart racing with a mixture of dread and desperation. The moment I crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind me, the sound reverberating like a death knell. The air changed instantly, colder and heavier, carrying the faint smell of decay. I was no longer in the forest. I was in a long, narrow hallway illuminated by a dim, flickering light that seemed to come from nowhere. The walls were damp, covered in moss and scratches that resembled claw marks. As I took a hesitant step forward, the floor creaked beneath me, and I realized I wasn't alone. A faint shuffling sound echoed from the far end of the hallway, accompanied by the same clicking noise I had heard earlier. My pulse quickened as I strained to see what lay ahead, but the light was too dim. Then, just as I began to convince myself it was my imagination, a shape emerged from the darkness. A tall, impossibly thin figure with limbs that seemed to stretch forever. Its head tilted unnaturally, and its hollow eyes glowed with that same malevolent red light. It didn't move at first, but its presence was overwhelming, suffocating. Then it raised one hand, its fingers impossibly long and clawed, and pointed directly at me. My blood turned to ice as the whispers returned, louder and more insistent than ever. "You opened the door," they said, "and now you belong to us." I tried to scream, but the air was too thick. My vision blurred, and the last thing I saw before everything went black was the figure stepping closer, its claws reaching out to claim me. I stood frozen, the faint flickering light casting distorted shadows that danced across the damp, narrow hallway. My breath came in ragged gasps, the air too thick and cold to fill my lungs. The figure loomed at the far end of the corridor, impossibly tall and grotesquely thin, its limbs elongated in unnatural ways. Its head tilted, jerking slightly, as though testing the limits of its twisted anatomy. The glow of its hollow, crimson eyes pierced through the suffocating darkness, locking onto mine with a gaze that seemed to strip away not just my courage, but my very sense of self. It moved then, its motions unnervingly deliberate, like a puppet being manipulated by invisible strings. Each step it took reverberated through the hallway, a deep, resonant thud that seemed to echo within my chest. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body betrayed me, rooted in place by a fear so primal it felt like I had been claimed by the shadows themselves. The whispers that had plagued me in the forest returned, louder now, a cacophony of guttural voices that overlapped and merged into a single, menacing chant. The blood moon demands its offering. In desperation, I forced my legs to move, stumbling backward as the figure advanced. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly, the walls closing in around me, their surfaces pulsing as if alive. The scratches on the walls transformed, morphing into symbols I couldn't recognize but instinctively knew were ancient and powerful. They glowed faintly, pulsating in sync with the rhythm of the figure's steps, as if the very fabric of this place was tethered to its will. My retreat was halted by the sudden appearance of a door behind me, a massive, ornate structure that hadn't been there moments before. Its surface was carved with intricate patterns that mirrored the symbols glowing on the walls, and at its center was the same mark that had been etched into my hand. The whispers rose to a crescendo, urging me toward the door, their tone filled with both menace and urgency. I turned the handle, my trembling fingers slick with sweat, and the door creaked open to reveal a circular chamber bathed in an eerie crimson light. At the center of the room stood an altar, identical to the one from the forest, but this time it wasn't empty. Resting on its surface was a small, ancient-looking box, its edges adorned with dark, metallic engravings that seemed to shimmer with a life of their own. The air in the chamber was thick with the metallic scent of blood, and the walls seemed to pulse faintly, as though the entire room were alive. The figure was now at the doorway, its towering form blocking any escape. It didn't speak, but its presence demanded obedience, an unspoken command that resonated deep within my mind. As if compelled by a force I couldn't resist, I stepped closer to the altar, my gaze fixed on the box. It seemed to hum faintly, vibrating with an energy that felt both ancient and malevolent. The whispers quieted, replaced by a deafening silence that pressed down on me like a physical weight. I reached out, my hand trembling as it hovered above the box. The symbol on my palm began to glow, burning with an intensity that made me wince in pain. The air grew colder, the crimson light dimming as shadows began to creep along the edges of the chamber. When I finally touched the box, a wave of energy surged through me, cold and electric, as if I had been struck by lightning. The room around me twisted violently, the walls bending and stretching as though reality itself were tearing apart. The box snapped open, releasing a blinding burst of red light that illuminated the chamber in horrifying detail. The walls were no longer just damp and scratched. They were covered in faces, human and monstrous, screaming silently in an eternal torment. The altar cracked and splintered, revealing a pit of swirling darkness beneath it, an abyss that seemed to pulse with the same rhythm as the symbols. The figure stepped into the chamber, its presence now overwhelming, and raised its clawed hand. From the pit rose tendrils of shadow, writhing and coiling like living things, reaching for me. I tried to pull away, but my body refused to obey. The tendrils wrapped around my arms and legs, cold and unyielding, pulling me toward the altar. The figure tilted its head once more, and for the first time it spoke. Its voice was deep and resonant, echoing as though it came from the void itself. "You have opened the door. Now you belong to the blood moon." In that moment, the symbol on my palm flared brighter than ever, and a searing pain shot through my entire body. My vision blurred, and my mind was filled with images, visions of the forest, the altar, and countless others before me who had stood where I now stood, all consumed by the same nightmare. As the darkness closed in around me, I could hear the whispers once more, their tone triumphant and final. And then, everything went silent. When I awoke, I was back in my room, or so it seemed. The soft glow of the streetlight outside cast familiar shadows on the walls, and the hum of distant traffic was the only sound I could hear. But something felt off. My body ached, and my hand throbbed with an unbearable heat. When I turned on the bedside lamp, my breath caught in my throat. The symbol was still there, etched into my palm as if it had been carved with a blade. The edges glowed faintly, pulsating in rhythm with my racing heartbeat. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself it was just a vivid nightmare. But as I stared at the mark, a wave of nausea washed over me, and faint whispers began to creep into my ears, soft at first, like the rustling of leaves, but growing louder and more distinct. The words were foreign, guttural, yet filled with a terrifying authority. I stumbled out of bed, desperate to shake the feeling, but the whispers followed me, echoing in the corners of the room. Unable to stay still, I turned to my laptop, searching for anything that could explain the symbol. At first, there was nothing, no records, no matches. But then I stumbled upon something that froze the blood in my veins. an obscure blog written by someone named Elias Moore, detailing an ancient phenomenon tied to the blood moon. Elias claimed that during the blood moon, the veil between worlds weakened, allowing nightmares to cross into reality. Among his entries was a crude sketch of the symbol now burned into my hand. According to Elias, the symbol wasn't just a mark, it was a calling. Those branded by it were connected to a place called the Crimson Beyond, a realm of chaos and despair that consumed those who dared to challenge its boundaries. Elias's final entry ended abruptly, with one chilling line, "Once marked, there is no escape." A chill ran down my spine as I scrolled further, finding a thread of comments from people who claimed to have had similar dreams. Their descriptions matched mine almost exactly: the forest, the altar, the figure with hollow crimson eyes. But what terrified me most was that none of them had posted again after sharing their experiences. It was as if they had vanished. Determined to find answers, I widened my search, combing through old newspapers and local legends. That's when I discovered something that made my heart stop. The forest from my dream wasn't just a figment of my imagination, it existed. An old article detailed the disappearance of several hikers in a remote woodland area during a blood moon decades ago. Witnesses claimed to have seen a strange red glow emanating from the forest on the night of the disappearances, and those who ventured close enough spoke of hearing whispers and feeling an overwhelming sense of dread. The article mentioned a local historian who had researched the area's dark past, tying it to tales of rituals performed under the blood moon. These rituals were said to open a gateway to another realm, one that demanded a sacrifice. The historian, however, had disappeared shortly after publishing his findings, his home left untouched except for a single journal found on his desk. The journal described dreams eerily similar to mine, ending with a chilling warning: beware the figure with the crimson eyes. It does not forgive. The pieces began to fall into place, and the realization hit me like a cold wave. My dream wasn't just a nightmare. It was a connection to something far older and far darker than I could comprehend. The symbol wasn't a warning. It was a seal, a tether linking me to the blood moon and whatever dwelled in its shadow. But it didn't end there. In the following days, strange occurrences began to plague me. Objects in my apartment moved on their own. A glass would shatter without reason, lights flickered despite no electrical issues, and shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should. At night, I would wake to find the symbol on my palm glowing faintly, its heat burning into my skin as whispers filled my ears. The final straw came when I found a photograph pinned to my door. It was old, the edges yellowed and curling, showing a group of people standing in front of a dense forest. At the edge of the group stood a man I recognized instantly, Elias Moore. His face was hollow, his expression one of terror, and in his hand, he clutched a journal identical to the one described in the articles I'd read. Scrawled on the back of the photo in crimson ink were the words, "The Crimson Beyond awaits. You cannot hide." My hands trembled as I read the message, the whispers growing louder, as if the forest itself were calling me back. I knew I couldn't ignore the signs any longer. Whatever was happening to me wasn't going to stop. The blood moon had marked me, and the forest was waiting. But the question remained, was I its next victim, or its next offering? Driven by the growing whispers and the overwhelming evidence that my nightmare was more than just a dream, I knew I couldn't stay idle. The forest, the one that matched every detail from my dream, was only a few hours away. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to turn back, to ignore the pull of the blood moon, but the mark on my palm burned hotter with each passing moment, urging me forward like an unseen tether. It wasn't just fear that drove me. It was a haunting curiosity, a need to uncover what this place was and why it had chosen me. I arrived at the edge of the forest as the sun began to set, its golden light casting long, distorted shadows over the trees. The air was unnervingly still, as though the entire world was holding its breath. The entrance to the forest was marked by an old wooden sign, its paint faded and illegible, but the symbol etched into the wood was unmistakable. The same mark that burned on my hand. My heart pounded in my chest as I stepped past the threshold, the weight of the atmosphere shifting instantly. It felt as though I'd crossed into another world, one where the laws of reality no longer applied. The deeper I ventured, the more oppressive the forest became. The trees seemed to grow closer together, their gnarled branches intertwining above me, blocking out the fading light. The whispers returned, faint at first but growing louder with every step. They weren't random. They were speaking to me, their guttural tones weaving a story of suffering, of others who had walked this path before me and never returned. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared, the forest was plunged into darkness, broken only by the glow of the blood moon rising above the treetops. Its crimson light painted the landscape in shades of red, casting eerie, shifting shadows across the ground. The mark on my palm burned brighter, its glow illuminating the path ahead like a sinister beacon. I tried to steady my breathing, but the air felt thicker, colder, and every sound seemed amplified. The crunch of leaves beneath my feet, the rustling of unseen movements in the underbrush, and the faint, almost imperceptible sound of footsteps that weren't my own. It was then that I heard a voice, not a whisper, but a clear, human voice cutting through the oppressive silence. "You shouldn't be here." The voice belonged to a woman, her figure emerging from the shadows like a ghost. She was pale, her face lined with exhaustion and fear, and her eyes darted nervously around the forest as if expecting something to appear at any moment. "My name is Lasara," she said, her voice trembling. "I've been here before. I've seen what you're about to face." Her words sent a chill through me, but before I could respond, she stepped closer, grabbing my arm. Her touch was cold, her grip desperate. "You have to leave now. The blood moon doesn't just choose, it consumes." Her warning hung heavy in the air, but before I could process it, the forest came alive. The whispers grew deafening, a cacophony of voices screaming in unison. The ground beneath us trembled, and the shadows began to move, coiling and writhing like living creatures. Lasara's grip tightened, and she pulled me forward. "There's no time. If you've been marked, you have to see it through. There's no escaping this." We ran, the crimson light of the moon illuminating our path as the shadows pursued us, their forms constantly shifting into grotesque, half-human shapes with hollow, screaming faces. The air grew colder with each step, and the forest seemed to close in around us, the trees twisting and bending as though alive. Lasara led me to a clearing, and there, in the center, stood the altar from my dream. It was exactly as I remembered it, covered in dark, dried blood, its surface carved with the same ancient symbols. But now, it was surrounded by a ring of faintly glowing stones, their light pulsing in time with the mark on my hand. "This is where it began," Lasara whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding in my ears. "The blood moon feeds on us, on our fear, our pain. And once it has you, it doesn't let go." Her words sent a shiver down my spine, but before I could respond, the shadows reached the edge of the clearing, halting just beyond the circle of stones. The air grew unbearably cold, and the whispers shifted, their tone now mocking, almost gleeful. From the darkness, the figure emerged, the same towering, grotesque being from my dream. Its crimson eyes burned with a malevolent intensity, and its movements were slow, deliberate, as it stepped into the clearing. Lasara backed away, her face pale with terror. "You have to face it," she said, her voice breaking. "It's the only way." I turned to her, desperate for answers, but she was gone, her figure dissolving into the shadows as though she had never been there. I was alone now, trapped in the clearing with the altar and the creature that had haunted my dreams. Its hollow eyes bore into me, and as it raised a clawed hand, I felt the mark on my palm burn with an intensity that brought me to my knees. The whispers stopped, replaced by a deep, guttural voice that resonated through the clearing. "You are ours now." And as the creature stepped closer, its shadow enveloping me, I realized there was no escape. The blood moon had chosen me, and whatever came next was beyond my comprehension. The creature loomed over me, its shadow stretching impossibly long in the crimson light of the blood moon. My entire body felt paralyzed, pinned by the weight of its gaze. Its eyes, empty yet searingly bright, seemed to pierce through my soul, dredging up memories I had buried long ago. The whispers returned, no longer disjointed but speaking in unison, a dark symphony of voices. They called my name, taunting me, weaving my own fears into their haunting melody. The altar at the center of the clearing began to pulse with an ominous light, each beat sending a ripple of energy through the ground beneath me. Symbols I hadn't noticed before illuminated across its surface, their intricate designs shifting as though alive. Then, as if summoned by the creature's presence, the shadows surrounding the clearing began to writhe, their forms twisting into grotesque shapes. Human figures with elongated limbs, faces frozen in expressions of agony. A cold voice echoed in the clearing, resonating from nowhere and everywhere at once. It wasn't the creature speaking, but something far older, far darker. "The blood moon binds us. The offering has been chosen. Now the truth must be revealed." The mark on my palm flared with a searing heat, the pain so intense I cried out, clutching my hand as the glow spread up my arm. The burning sensation wasn't just physical. It felt as though it were etching itself into my mind, flooding me with images and memories that didn't belong to me. I saw glimpses of others who had stood where I now stood, their faces pale with terror as the blood moon consumed them. They were screaming, reaching out for help that never came. Then I saw her, a woman cloaked in shadow, her features obscured but unmistakably familiar. She was standing at the same altar, her hand outstretched toward a box identical to the one I had opened in my dream. I realized with a jolt of horror that it was my mother, years younger, but it was her. The memory felt vivid, real, as if I were witnessing something my mind had locked away. She had been here, marked like me, and she had made the same journey. The vision dissolved, and the creature took a step forward, its movements unnervingly deliberate. It raised a long, clawed finger and pointed at the altar. The voice returned, now sharper, more commanding. "Choose." My eyes darted to the altar, and I saw it, a small, ancient artifact, its surface carved with the same shifting symbols as the altar itself. The whispers grew louder, urging me toward it, promising salvation, but beneath their seductive tone, I could hear the truth: they were lying. The artifact pulsed with a dark energy that resonated with the mark on my hand. I turned back to the creature, trembling. Its face began to change, the shadows peeling away to reveal something even more horrifying. It wasn't faceless anymore, it was wearing my face. The realization hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just a creature, it was a reflection of me, twisted and broken by the power of the blood moon. The whispers demanded my decision, but every fiber of my being screamed against it. The artifact called to me, its presence both alluring and repulsive. If I took it, I felt certain it would grant me power, but at an unimaginable cost. I glanced back at the shadows circling the clearing, their grotesque forms shifting closer, their tortured faces a stark reminder of what awaited me if I refused. My mother's face flashed in my mind again. She had stood here, just as I was now. What choice had she made? And had it cost her life? The thought burned into me as the creature raised both arms, the clearing filling with an ear-splitting roar. The blood moon seemed to grow larger, its crimson light bathing everything in an oppressive glow. Desperation clawed at my mind. I could take the artifact and risk losing myself forever, or I could resist, and likely perish. Either way, the blood moon demanded its due. As the creature took another step forward, its claws reaching for me, I made my choice. I grabbed the artifact, the cold metal burning against my skin as the symbols flared with a blinding light. The whispers turned to screams, deafening and chaotic, as if the entire forest were crying out in agony. The ground beneath me shattered, and I was pulled into a swirling vortex of shadow and crimson light. The last thing I saw before everything went dark was the creature's face, my face, twisting into a grotesque grin. And then silence. When I woke, I was lying in a hospital bed, surrounded by sterile white walls and the hum of medical equipment. The mark on my palm was gone, but I could still feel its presence, a phantom ache that refused to fade. The doctors said I had been found unconscious at the edge of the forest, but they couldn't explain how I got there or what had happened to me. The artifact was gone, but the nightmares weren't. Every night, I dream of the blood moon, the forest, and the creature that wore my face. And every morning, I wake to find the faint outline of the mark glowing on my palm, a silent reminder that my choice wasn't the end, it was just the beginning. Since that night, nothing in my life has felt real. The days blur together, and the nights are consumed by relentless, vivid nightmares. The blood moon's glow still haunts me in my sleep, bathing my dreams in crimson light. I can feel the forest watching me, its whispers echoing in my mind even as I sit in the safety of my home. But I know better now, there's no true safety, not anymore. The mark on my palm, though invisible to others, burns faintly at times like a brand seared into my soul. It glows in moments of darkness, as if it's alive, waiting for something. And then there are the shadows, those fleeting, impossible shapes that linger just outside my vision. They're everywhere, in the corners of my room, beneath the flickering streetlights, and sometimes reflected in mirrors. They don't move when I do, and I'm certain they're not mine. The strangest part is how the world around me seems fractured. Objects disappear only to reappear in places I'm sure I didn't leave them. People speak words that I swear I've already heard, as if I'm trapped in a loop. And then there's the symbol, the one from the altar, from my dreams. It started appearing in the real world. I've seen it scratched into the wood of a park bench, painted onto the wall of an abandoned building, and once, horrifyingly, scrawled in ash on my bedroom ceiling when I woke. But perhaps the most chilling sign came last week. I received a package with no return address. Inside was a single photograph, old and faded, of the forest bathed in the red glow of the blood moon. At the center of the clearing stood the altar, and on it was the artifact I had held in my hands. My breath caught in my throat as I turned the photo over. Written in dark, crimson ink were the words, "The blood moon is not done with you." Every part of me wanted to burn the photo, to forget everything, but I knew it wouldn't matter. Whatever has marked me isn't bound by the rules of reality. The mark is a thread tying me to the blood moon, and no amount of denial will sever it. I've started hearing the whispers again, not just in my dreams, but in the waking world. They creep into my ears when I'm alone, faint and teasing, as if daring me to listen closer. At first, they were faint murmurings, but now they're louder, more distinct. They speak my name. They know my fears. And worse, they remind me of something I can no longer ignore. The blood moon is coming again. I've tried to prepare, to understand what I unleashed. I've read every report, scoured every ancient text, and even returned to the historian's journal I found online. But nothing offers answers, only more questions. The few who have survived the blood moon's mark write only in riddles, their words dripping with madness and fear. One phrase repeats in every account, chilling me to my core. The second moonrise is the reckoning. What does it mean? What happens when the blood moon rises again? I can feel the clock ticking down, every whisper a reminder that my time is running out. The mark on my palm glows brighter each night, its heat unbearable, as if it's feeding off something deep within me. The truth is, I don't know if I'll survive what's coming. I don't even know if I'm alive now, or if I've been trapped in the blood moon's grasp since that night. But one thing is certain, the blood moon isn't finished with me, and whatever waits for me on the other side of its light is beyond comprehension. What would you do if you were me? Would you run? Would you fight? Or would you surrender to the inevitable? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you've ever experienced anything like this, if you've seen the blood moon or heard its whispers, tell your story. Maybe together we can uncover the truth. But be careful. Sometimes acknowledging the darkness only makes it stronger. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories of the unknown. Because as I've learned the hard way, the line between dreams and reality is thinner than we think. And when the blood moon rises again, it won't just be my story, it could be yours too.